Thank you very much, Professor Reynolds, and thank all of you for coming here today. This is my first trip ever to Santa Barbara, and I've only been here for a few hours, but just before we entered, I asked Professor Reynolds whether there was a spot for a journalism professor somewhere in your faculty. It's quite a wonderful place and quite a welcoming place, so I thank you very, very much. I would like to start by telling you a little bit about my first encounter with Iran and confess something. I'm not, and I have never been, an expert on Persia. I started in French history in graduate school, and in particular the history of 18th century France and the French Revolution. So my editors at Newsweek sent me to Paris, where I covered stories like the fashion shows, and once in a while I get to do something serious like medium-range missiles, which we were deploying in Europe at the time. And then an obscure cleric wearing a turban named Ayatollah Khomeini came to Paris in exile. And I was the junior person and the only woman in a bureau of four other very senior men and me. And frankly, none of them wanted to go out to this little village 25 miles outside of Paris every day. So I was young and eager, and I went out there, and I got to know the Ayatollah and his people. So that when it came time to send somebody on his plane when he made his revolution, a very forward-looking editor at Newsweek said, "We're sending her." I didn't realize at the time just how dangerous the flight was. Ayatollah Khomeini banned all women, Iranian women, from going on the plane, but he didn't really care that much about journalists. But there actually was a plan by the head of the Iranian Air Force to blow up the plane. And the plan was taken to the Carter administration, to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor at the time, who brought the plan to President Carter. Now, Carter looked at this plan and he said, I want to have nothing to do with it, and turned it down. But Brzezinski never told the Iranian general, General Rabii, that the Iranians couldn't carry it out themselves. And I often wonder what would have happened, not only to the history of Iran's revolution, but also to ABC News if the plane had been blown up, because Peter Jennings was also on that flight. So I get to Iran as a journalist. The plane we arrived safely, and as we were driving into Tehran the day of Khomeini's arrival, there was a banner that was strung across one of the main thoroughfares, and it said in 4 languages, in Farsi, Arabic, French, and English, "Welcome to the journalists coming with the Ayatollah." So I thought, okay, this isn't bad. Well, a few weeks later, we went to the holy city of Qom with Ayatollah Khomeini, where he had been teaching and studying for many years, and from where he had been exiled in the 1960s. And they put the journalists traveling with him on this flatbed truck in a procession. And some young men came around the truck and started chanting something. So I turned to my colleague and said, what are they chanting? And he said, they're chanting, "Where's the BBC man? We want to kill him." I tell this story because I think these images capture just how difficult it is for us as outsiders to understand a country like Iran. There is a very forward-looking journalist named Mashallah Shamsul-Vaizin, who once said to me, "We don't know where the red lines are." Well, this is a man who started the first true reformist newspaper after the election of President Mohammad Khatami as president in 1997. And each time it was closed, he opened it up under a different name with a different license, which was legal. Well, the 5th time it was done, it was closed for good, and Shamsul-Vaizin is behind bars. Indeed, he didn't know where the red lines are. And that's because Iran is a country of improvisation. It's not a totalitarian country. If it were a totalitarian country, we would know what the rules are. In Washington, where I live, policymakers tend to think in terms of long-term strategies. And it's often said that Iran is, that Iran invented chess, and that Iranians are brilliant chess players, always plotting 10 steps ahead. I sort of look at Iranians as players in a jazz band, changing the rhythm and the tempo as they go along. And I sometimes feel sad that President Clinton isn't going to be around for very much longer, because if you look at the instrument he plays, it's the saxophone. And if anybody could understand this rhythm and tempo and improvisation, he can. Even Ayatollah Khomeini, who appeared to us on the outside as such a stern, strict, rigid leader, was a master a master at improvisation. I'm not even going to try that now, and it's been a long day. You have to excuse me, Professor. He was a master politician, and he changed his views when it suited his purposes. I mean, for example, years before the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini wrote that women should not be allowed to vote. And yet, when the revolution occurred, he needed women. So he sent women out on the streets. He told women who had never worked, who had stayed in their kitchens, to put on their chadors, their veils, and go out into the streets and demonstrate for the Islamic Republic. And when it came time to vote for a referendum on whether there should be an Islamic Republic or not, women voted. Ayatollah Khomeini also said that he would never end the war with Iraq until Iran was victorious and Iraq became an Islamic Republic and Saddam Hussein was overthrown. But after 8 years of war, he announced on radio quite stunningly that he had drunk a cup of poison, that the decision to end the war was as terrifying and terrible as taking poison, and in one day the war was over. The same thing with Saudi Arabia. Ayatollah Khomeini once said that all of the monarchs in the Persian Gulf should be thrown into the dustbin of history. But now Iran has cordial, if not friendly, relations with Saudi Arabia. Yet in the United States, when we look at Iran, I think sometimes we're trapped by our images. The questions I get asked the most about Iran is, aren't you afraid when you go there, and you have to wear that veil? Terrorists and veils. These are the two prevailing images, I would say, if Americans think about Iran, when they think about Iran at all. And sure, there have been times in traveling through Iran over the last 21 years that I have been terrified. And there have been times when I have worn the veil that one holds under the chin called the chador. But generally, my time in Iran has not been one of a time of fear, and it's been a time of my experimentation. Another question I get asked often about Iran is, why should we care? I was actually asked this question at the Council on Foreign Relations about a year ago. Why should the United States care about Iran? We have done just fine, the questioner said, dealing with Iran with no diplomatic relations. We even fought a war against Iraq, formed an international coalition, and left Iran on the sidelines. I would argue, on the crassest level, look at oil prices. On the most Machiavellian plane, Iran is the second largest oil producer in OPEC. In part because of its close relationship with Saudi Arabia, there's more unity in OPEC, and that has contributed to higher oil prices. Iran's the only country that borders both the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. And were it not for American policy that prevents oil companies from building a pipeline through Iran, there probably would be construction right now. Iran is also, eventually, will be an extraordinary market for U.S. investment. You can't fly on an airplane inside Iran and not fly on a Boeing jet. You can't look at the oil fields and not see an American infrastructure. The same thing with their hotels. So much of the infrastructure is American. And we also forget that before the revolution, there were 50,000 Americans living in Iran. On another level, on the geopolitical level, Iran is one of our last enemies. You know, we don't have very many enemies left in the world, and sometimes I think we in Washington like to invent enemies. But if you look at the rhetoric of Governor Bush still calls Iran a rogue state. And you know, if he's elected president, he has vowed to spend up to $80 billion building a national missile defense against countries like North Korea, Iraq, and Iran. Iran also lives in a dangerous neighborhood. You know, people ask me all the time, well, isn't Iran trying to develop a nuclear weapon? Now, I don't see the intelligence, and my friends in the intelligence community say that, you know, Iran is procuring technology that can only be used for nuclear weapons. But I have to tell you, if I were the president of Iran, I would be building a nuclear weapon too, or I would at least be pretending to build a nuclear weapon, because who are my neighbors? I've got Iraq on the left with more than a 700-mile border. You know, Iraq that used chemical weapons against me in the Iran-Iraq war and was trying to build a nuclear weapon. And Pakistan on the right. Now, where did Pakistan test its nuclear weapon? On Iran's border. Finally, I would say that one of the reasons we should care about Iran is because of its people. I don't think Iran's greatest resource is its oil. I think it's its people. In all my travels in various countries around the world over the last 20 years, I have never met a more resourceful and hospitable people than the Iranians. There is an extraordinary affinity for Americans. You know, a whole generation of Iranians was trained and studied in the United States. And I can't go anywhere in the country without having some person have a friend or a relative in the without meeting somebody who's had a friend or a relative in the United States. You know, I sometimes think that Iranians aren't looking for apologies, they're looking for visas. Now, in trying to define Iran and what's going on in terms of politics today, I like to define it in terms of a series of guerrilla battlefields. I mean, one of the reasons I decided to write this book is that after the election of President Khatami, there was an explosion of democracy. And it wasn't Jeffersonian democracy like we know and love. It was tentative, it was questioning, but it was real. It was saying that the Islamic Republic, as it has been implemented by the clerical leaders, is not what the revolution was all about. The revolution was supposed to be a democratic revolution. It was supposed to be an Islamic republic, meaning a modern theocracy, but ruled by the people. Now, where are these battlefields? Well, look at the press. After Khatami's election, there was an explosion of newspapers and magazines. Hundreds of newspapers and magazines suddenly came on the scene. People took every bit of savings that they had. It's a lot cheaper to publish a newspaper now. And people were writing every day. In fact, there aren't any political parties in Iran. And what was happening is that you saw a newspaper print an article one day and the rebuttal the next day. So that people opened up their newspapers and found this exciting laboratory where volatile chemicals of Islam and democracy were being experimented with. So what happened? In last April, most of the reformist papers and magazines were shut down. Well, why were they shut down? They were shut down because, frankly, they were beginning to pose a threat to the government. You know, I don't pose a threat to the government. I'm an occasional visitor. I come in, I write my stories, I leave. The real danger to the regime is the people inside. But even with the closure of the reformist press, it's not total, because this is not a totalitarian state. I was just in Iran a few weeks ago, and I went to visit a cleric who had just come out of prison. Now, here's a man who is an expert on Islam. He's written dozens of books, and he was sent to prison. Why? Because he had suggested that the rule of the clerics was as repressive as the rule of the Shah. He was put into prison for his words. He was one of them and was put into prison for 18 months. Now, he had time to write his doctoral dissertation when he was in prison, and they let him out for a few days to defend it. But again, this is Iran. So I'm sitting in his living room, and the phone rings. And it's Akbar Ganji, who is a reformist newspaperman, a muckraking journalist, who had been making all sorts of wild accusations about the former president Rafsanjani, and he's in prison. He's calling from prison. For the life, they never let journalists go to these prisons, so I have no idea where the payphones are, but somehow the guy gets access to a telephone. And he called the cleric because he was very excited, because an article that he, Ganji, had written in prison and smuggled out had been printed in a reformist newspaper that the authorities hadn't gotten to yet in Far Zanjan province. So it's like, I look at this battlefield as like there's too many rats out in the field and they can't get all of them. I also look at the parliament as one of these guerrilla battlefields. Last February, the people of Iran went to the polls and they voted in a reformist parliament. 70% of those in parliament believe in democratic reform. But what happened? One of the first things the parliament tried to do was to reform a very restrictive press law. Now, in Iran's structure, the president doesn't have all the power. The person who has more power than the president is the spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And Ayatollah Khamenei, who has control of the army, the security forces, the intelligence forces, the radio and television, the judiciary, announced that the parliament wouldn't be allowed to consider this law. I have never seen so many Iranians of so many different classes and different political affiliations so upset that they had been prevented from having their parliament do the will of the people, carry out the will of the people. And in my last trip, I met with a 31-year-old female parliamentarian. She's new to politics, and at 31, she's one of the youngest members of parliament ever. And she is fearless. And I asked her whether the leader, the spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, had violated the Constitution by banning consideration of the press law. And she said, yes, the way he intervened is unprecedented in our history. This is dangerous stuff. They're playing with fire. Another battlefield in Iran, another one of these guerrilla battlefields, is the courts. And we look at Iran from the outside and we see a judiciary that, for example, has convicted a number of Jews because of their cooperation with Israel. But I look at the judiciary not only as a repressive institution, but as a vehicle for change. And I want to tell you about the trial of the mayor of Tehran a couple of years ago. The mayor of Tehran was trained as a cleric, so that means that he had the tools of the clergy to use against the clergy. You know, he knew the Quran, he knew the ropes, he knew the rules, so that when he was put on trial for corruption, he had as much training as the judge who was trying him. And in this particular court, by the way, the judge also served as prosecutor and jury. And this mayor is a very clever man. He had not a lot of allies in the television, and he worked it out so that his trial would be televised. I mean, this was like Iran's version of the OJ trial. People kept their kids up till 2 and 3 in the morning to watch the first political trial ever made public in Iran's history. I mean, here it was, a living civics lesson on TV every single night. And Karbashi would do things like, he'd come in the morning and, they'd open the court, and he would start praying from the Quran. And so the judge would say to him, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, this isn't the time for prayers. And Karbashi, the mayor, would turn to the judge and he'd say, excuse me, Mr. Judge, it's always time for prayers. And the judge would say, but not in my courtroom. So suddenly Karbashi was making fun of the judge. He also used this televised court appearance to reveal some hitherto taboo issues. In the middle of his trial, he said, yes, sir, you have lots of testimony from my deputy mayors that you took under confession, but they confessed under duress. You know, until then, the issue of torture in prison had been talked about quietly in people's living rooms or by human rights groups outside the country, but never on Iranian national television. Suddenly, people who had suffered torture felt vindicated. Karbashi was so clever that there was one night when his testimony was supposed to air at the same time as the World Cup soccer match, because Iran was playing in the World Cup in France a couple of years ago. And so he maneuvered it so that he could postpone his trial that day for another time, because he wanted to maximize his television audience. It's another guerrilla battlefield. Speaking of television, those of you who follow Iran know that television technically is controlled by the spiritual leader Ayatollah Khamenei. And you can't turn on Iranian television without seeing clerics on TV giving sermons, doing debates, advising people about how to pray or how to wash themselves or how to eat or when to fast. But somebody let some very creative producers in on the entertainment side. And what they have done is they've done sort of taken a sociological approach to entertainment TV. And there are these very daring soap operas in which real live issues that affect every Iranian in one way or another are aired on TV every night. Serious issues like unemployment, the lack of places for university students at university, suicide, divorce, polygamy, child custody issues. Every night they are being discussed openly. Again, making people who suffer these problems feel that there are possibilities. Finally, another one of the battlefields is the streets. And the streets are being used on a number of different levels. You know, on one superficial level, it's used by women who are trying to fight the dress code. Now, my Iranian women friends sometimes criticize me because they say I write and talk too much about what women have to wear. They say to me, look, we put on the scarf and we go and do our business. You know, we've got bigger battles to fight than whether we have to put a headscarf on when we walk out of our house in the morning. But young women in Iran are saying, I don't really like this. Now, I've asked my women friends, why on International Women's Day, why doesn't everybody rip off their headscarves and just go bareheaded? You know, early in the revolution, you didn't have to wear a headscarf. You know, I even have pictures of me standing out in front of the American embassy when it was under seizure, with all the screaming young men saying death to America, and there I'm standing with my notebook, and I'm bareheaded. But the rule changed, and suddenly it's a law that women have to keep their heads covered. So what are young women doing? Well, young women are dyeing their hair every wild color you can imagine and wearing their headscarf back. It's this gravity-defying thing as far back as they possibly can. My younger daughter asked me, my younger daughter's 10, and she asked me one day, Mom, why do women get their hair done if they have to wear headscarves? Well, it's a little bit of a rebellion. Women are also, young women, teenagers, some of them, are cross-dressing as men, as teenage boys. There are always stories in the paper about young women who get arrested because they just don't want to wear a headscarf, so they've cut off all their hair and worn blue jeans and big shirts and tried to pass themselves off as boys. You know, I've even seen a woman walking on the street once, bald, with a shaved head, because in the Quran, it only talks about covering your hair. It doesn't talk about covering your head. Now, I decided to have my own one woman's revolution in Iran when I went to Iran with a group of American tourists, and this was an ordinary group of Americans. Most of them were upper middle class, most of them were retired. This was a very sophisticated, well-traveled group. They didn't take chances. This was the kind of group that they carried their own blood plasma and hypodermic needles with them, and they had been everywhere. But after about 3 days of being in 95 degree heat, the women got fed up. They took themselves out of these long robes and put their husbands' shirts on over their pants and started wearing these hunting, fishing hats that you can buy from those catalogs. And when we went on the tour bus, they actually took their headscarves off and these hats off. So we literally stopped traffic because no Iranian had seen women unveiled in public for years. So lately I've taken to wearing a hat. But on a more serious level, the streets are being used by young people. I was in Iran during the riots of the summer of 1999, where students protesting the closure of a reformist newspaper, rioted in 24 Iranian cities. The clerics were so terrified by this mass movement that they turned off every cell phone in the country for 3 days. Because just as cassette tapes by Ayatollah Khomeini had been used and sent back to Iran to make his revolution, sent from Paris to Iran to the bazaars and the mosques, the cell phones were being used by students to coordinate movements and to warn each other where the security forces were, where the vigilantes were carrying batons. The cell phone became a dangerous weapon. I actually heard students chanting slogans against Ayatollah Khamenei, the spiritual leader. This could have put any of them in prison, and some of them are still in prison. And one chant was particularly moving. They said, "The clerics have become God, and the people have become poor." Now, where is President Khatami in all of this? I mean, those of you who follow Iran know that he campaigned in 1997 on a platform to create the rule of law, to create a civil society, and he preached a message of tolerance. You know, he told people to respect each other and to take responsibility for their actions. You know, Iran is a country where people tend to look for a hero to sort of take care of them. And he was saying, there's no one to take care of you. You have to take care of yourselves. Well, I traveled with him around the country in 1998, and I saw a man who was extraordinarily connected to the people. It's hard to adequately describe just how charismatic he is. You know, we think of the clerics as dour, strict, serious men who don't look at women. You know, Ayatollah Khomeini never looked at me when I interviewed him, and Ayatollah Khamenei did not look at me when I interviewed him when he was president. But President Khatami is a different breed. You know, he was trained as a philosopher. He grew up, he was the son of an Ayatollah, and he didn't want to become a cleric, but he became a cleric because his father wanted him to. And he truly believes in connecting with people. In fact, the first time I ever met him, I found him so charismatic that I found myself saying to him, you know, you and President Clinton just should sit down together because the two of you, frankly, would have an awful lot to talk about. In all of my time interviewing world leaders, I've seldom seen someone who can connect with people like that. I mean, I've seen it with President Clinton, who is truly a people person. I've seen it with Nelson Mandela, and I've seen it with President Jacques Chirac of France on a good day. But I saw President Khatami at the United Nations this September. He was a sober, much more sober and much less confident man. He delivered 2 speeches at the UN in which he basically said nothing. And he invited a small group of journalists to breakfast, and we found him very defensive because he had no answer for why Iran is in this period of repression, except to say, I'm asking everybody to be patient. Yet he still enjoys extraordinary support at home. You know, I just came from Los Angeles, and there are so many Iranians who fled Iran at the time of the revolution and who really suffered at the hands of the clerics. You know, Iranians who lost property, Iranians who lost family members, Iranians who basically escaped with their lives. And they were stunned when I told them that a recent poll in Iran shows that if President Khatami were to run again as president, that 61% of the Iranian people would vote for him. And only 11% of the people said they would not. And the rest of the people basically said it would depend on the other candidates. We're also starting to see in Iran open discussions of differences between President Khatami and Ayatollah Khamenei. This is new, this is stunning. You know, even though the two of them are clerics, even though the two of them promote adherence to the Islamic Republic, there are differences between them. And I just want to quote something from a colleague of President Khatami, a cleric named Faisal Mebodi, who said to me during my recent trip to Iran, "It has become obvious that there are differences of opinion between the leader and Khatami. There have been occasions where Khatami has compromised, and other times he has resisted. Freedom has always been sacrificed in this country. During the revolution, that was one of the main principles. Unfortunately, it was never implemented." Again, this is dangerous stuff. Then he said, and this is coming from a cleric, "One of the obstacles for becoming a democratic society is the religious aspect of our society." So dealing with all of these contradictions and all of these cul-de-sacs and all of these mazes, how does somebody like me survive? How does an outsider, and all of us in one way or another are outsiders, how do we deal with a country like this, one of our last enemies on the planet? Well, I've come up with some of my own rules for survival over the years, and I'd like to share some of them with you. One of my rules is that one should never say no to an invitation, because everything meaningful in Iran happens behind closed doors. The Iranian people are not by nature confessional. You know, when we just look at the difference in our architecture, you know, we have front yards that give out to the streets. We put our lawn chairs out and we watch our neighbors walk their dogs. Iranians' houses are behind closed doors. They're behind gates, and you can see the ugliest gates with no paint and locked, and you walk in and you see gardens filled with roses and fountains, and it's another world. I mean, just look at the Iran-Contra affair. Iran was buying weapons from the United States, and it was perfectly fine. We were their enemy, and we were the great Satan, but it was perfectly fine until it became public. As long as it was secret, it was okay. Another one of my rules is that even seeing is not believing. You know, even what appears truthful somehow or sometimes maybe is not. It's kind of like Alice down the rabbit hole. I once interviewed the brother of President Khatami, who's now the leader of the reformist movement in Iran, but at the time he was the deputy minister of health. He hadn't been involved in politics, and we were having an interview about his brother. I was there to write a long profile about President Khatami. And towards the end of the interview, he felt relaxed, and he started just talking about some confidence-building measures that the United States might take to improve relations between the two countries. And I thought this was interesting, and so I said, "Well, sir, I know you're not a politician, but would it be okay if I wrote an article on these points?" And he said, "Oh, be my guest." So I wrote an article. It's what we call in the New York Times a shelf. It's the article that goes at the top of the page above the Bloomingdale's ads. And the next day he called me up, and he said, "Why did you write those things? I didn't say any of those things." And I said, "Excuse me, sir, but I have it on, I had a tape recorder there at the time. I have it on tape. I transcribed my tape." And he said, "Even if I said those things, you shouldn't have written them." And then he gave interviews to the local press saying that the New York Times had distorted his words. You know, I often think that there was a misunderstanding like this with Foreign Minister Karazi recently. I don't know if any of you followed the trial of the Iranian Jews. Just recently, all of the sentences of those convicted in Shiraz of cooperating with Israel were reduced. And some people think they actually heard Foreign Minister Karazi say that some of the prisoners might be released. Well, I've known the foreign minister for years and years because he used to be the ambassador at the UN, and he has an extraordinary ability of saying 4 different things in one paragraph. It's very different to sort out what is being said. And imagine if you're an American diplomat where only words matter, trying to figure Iran out. You know, even Iranians admit that things have to be kept secret and things have to be kept loose. I was talking recently in Iran to a man named Abbas Abdi, who was one of the hostage takers, actually, and we have a very interesting relationship because he was on the inside of the embassy walls and I was on the outside. And I asked him about the closure of the press because he had been the editor of one of the newspapers that was closed. And I asked him about whether the press was really irresponsible or not. And he said, even if we accept that the press was faulty, we wouldn't talk about it, or at least not openly, because if we criticize it, our words will be used against us. Speaking of rules, another one of my rules is that rules exist to be broken, or that almost anything can be negotiated. A long time ago, in 1982, I was in Iran to interview President Khamenei, who's now the spiritual leader. And I was the first American journalist they let in after the hostages had been released, and this was kind of a test case. And so I did the interview, and it was fine, and I left the country. And it worked so well that several weeks later, they invited in a group of about 30, 40 journalists. So I went along again with the journalists. And I showed up at the ministry that takes care of foreign journalists to get my press card, and they said, "What, you again?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm here." They said, "Well, we didn't like what you wrote about President Khamenei, and so we're going to have to expel you. So could you please get on a plane in 48 hours? I said, "That was a civil expulsion. Usually when they expel you, they just send you back to the airport." And I said, "Well, you're taking the journalists to the war front between now and then. Could I go along on the trip to the war front first?" And they said, "Well, you could, but women can't go to the war front. We don't allow any women journalists to go to the war front." And I said, "But I went to the war front a few weeks ago." And the gentleman just looked at me and he said, "The rules have changed." Another rule that I often use that comes in handy is that humor comes in handy. You know, in times of crisis, in times of closures, whether it's the former Soviet Union or China or Iran, laughter and joking is often a way to get your message across. In Iran recently, I interviewed the brother of a cleric who's in prison. The cleric had been a vice president under President Khatami and the Minister of the Interior. And he, like the cleric who I interviewed who was out of prison, is in prison because of his criticisms of the government, of the other clerics. So the brother, who's a surgeon and didn't know anything about politics, ran for parliament, and he got in because of his name, which says something about Iranian politics and how it's not too dissimilar from American politics. So I was interviewing this man, Ali Reza Nouri, and asking him about his brother, and he just said to me, "You know, we have only one cleric in our family, my brother, and he's in jail. It's funny that in an Islamic republic, the one cleric in our family is in jail, and the rest of us are free." When I went to see Abbas Abdi, this is the man who was the hostage taker, he always was a very serious man. I have never seen this man smile in my entire life, and I showed up to his office wearing a hat, not wearing a headscarf. And he looked at me, didn't smile, and just said, "You've come to the wrong country. You belong in Latin America." Another one of my rules, or maybe lessons is a better word, is that being a woman is my stealth weapon in a country like Iran. Now, this may sound strange to you because, you know, you see women with veils, women can't shake the hands of a man. How are you going to be able to maneuver in this country? Well, the secret of success, if you're a woman journalist, is women. Because I have access to 50% of the population that my male colleagues don't. I can go into beauty salons. I can go into aerobics studios behind closed doors. I can go into fashion design studios that are run in people's houses. I've even taken to carrying pictures of my kids with me because, you know, everywhere you go in Iran, people are always frisking you. You know, you go into a public building, you get bodily frisked. You go through an airport control to go to a different city, you get frisked. And after a while, it drives you crazy. And none of these women ever smile. So I whip out pictures of my kids, and we start talking, and I say a few words in Farsi, and these women start smiling. By the time they're finished frisking me, they're kissing me, too. So it's kind of like my personal dialogue among civilizations. Another one of my rules is that not only journalists have to watch their backs in a country like Iran, even people in the public domain have to be very careful what they do and say. A couple of years ago, I was interviewing the wife of President Khatami, and she had never done an interview before with an American journalist. So she was a bit cautious. And she was seated sort of next to me, and between us there was a table with some drinks and a bowl of flowers, some iris and white nargis and some yellow flowers. And in the middle of the bouquet was a single pink rose. And halfway through the interview, she looked at this bouquet and said, "There's a microphone in the flowers. Somebody is listening to our conversation." Now, it won't surprise you, having heard what I've said so far, that her official interpreter did not translate those words. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on. That microphone wasn't there for me. I was just asking questions. That microphone was there for her, because somewhere, someone thought that maybe there was something she would say that would be revelatory about her husband and maybe useful at another time. The last thing I learned about Iran is that Iranians love Americans. Now, this is going to sound weird to those of you who have seen Iran through the television screen and have heard the chants of "Death to America" over and over and over. But this struck me so much when I went with this tour of Americans to Iran, because we actually looked like tourists. I can actually pass for Persian wearing a scarf. My good Sicilian face can kind of pass. But these people couldn't. We stuck out like a sore thumb, this big busload of very American-looking people. People would come up to us. People just wanted to touch us. It was the most extraordinary encounter, because on some level, there is a connection with the United States. It comes through the internet, it comes through email, it comes through satellite television, it comes through our movies that are sold for $2 and $3 in videos on the streets, and it comes from our values. So how do we maneuver as a country with a place like Iran? Well, I often describe Iran as the Bermuda Triangle of American foreign policy, that any president who's tried to deal with Iran sort of sinks and just sort of disappears. And you know, we can recall that, that it was the day of Reagan's inauguration as president in 1980, that in 1981, January of 1981, when the Iranians decided to release the hostages. President Bush once picked up the phone thinking he was talking to President Rafsanjani, only to discover that it was an imposter. The Clinton administration is stuck with a policy of its own making. It started out by calling Iran a rogue state and an international outlaw. It then, a few years later, as Iran's behavior is getting better, imposes unilateral economic sanctions against Iran. And the administration's been trying to ease out of this hole ever since. When we look at the two presidential candidates, I can tell you that both of them, at least in their rhetoric and in the words of their advisors, take a tougher line towards Iran. Leon Firth, who is Vice President Gore's national security advisor, has told me that he considers Iran a rogue state that is determined to build weapons of mass destruction, that uses terrorism on a regular basis as an instrument of its state policy, and that is determined to sabotage the Middle East crisis. You know, he has said there is no room for an improvement of relations with Iran right now. George W. has called Iran also a rogue state. It's one of the things the two of them agree on. His national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, has taken just as hard a line as Leon Firth. In fact, they say almost the exact same words. Sometimes I think Leon Firth is Condoleezza Rice. It was interesting because Dick Cheney, for a couple of years, has been giving speeches in which he has called for the United States to lift its economic sanctions on Iran and to allow Americans to invest in Iran again. And when he was first named as Bush's running mate, he said, "I am going to change his views." Well, that lasted about 3 days, and until Cheney got with the message, got on the team, and then said, you know, "I will do what I'm told." So it remains to be seen what will happen. But having covered Washington as long as I have, I can tell you that any new administration takes at least 6 months before it comes up with a policy in an area where there is not an absolute riveting crisis. So trying to figure out all of these contradictions left me with a terrible dilemma on what I was going to call my book. I spent months trying to figure out the right title for the book, because it had to be something that captured complexity and captured humility. Because as many times as I've gone to Iran, every time I go back, it's another adventure and it throws me another curve. So I found the answer in a reception room in a palace built by Reza Shah, the father of the Shah who was overthrown in the 1979 revolution. It's a room a little bit smaller than this in the Green Palace, and it was a room that was just filled with thousands and thousands of mirror mosaics on the walls and the ceilings. And the first time I looked at this room, I felt very warm and welcomed. It was light-filled, it was dazzling, it just was sparkling. But then I tried to look at my face in these mirrors, and I couldn't see my face. Everything was distorted, and everything was cold and distant. And it's because of that that I decided to call the book Persian Mirrors. I thank you very, very much for coming this evening, and I would welcome your observations and your questions. Thank you.
Hi, I haven't had time to compose my question because I was going to wait, but I'll just go ahead. I was struck by the example that you gave with the brother who's the surgeon is the only member, well, the only member of his family who is the cleric is the one who's in jail. Mm-hmm. And everybody else is left free to do the politics. And as well, your comment about people being disillusioned with the way the Islamic Republic was supposed to have happened. And now the movement for reform is to somehow bring it back from its wandering ways. My question is, looking at all these fronts, all these battlefields, we've got women, students, a lot of different people in the streets, young people. What kind of democracy are these people envisioning for Iran? And what role does Islam have in that democracy? What kind of evidence do you see of the dream, the Islamic dream, the Iranian dream now?
Well, for someone who hasn't really thought out her question 100%, that's about the toughest question I've had since I left Washington. Well, you know, Iran is the world's only modern theocracy. So it's an experiment that is continuing. You know, I think of my book as like a political thriller, and we don't know the ending. I don't think they really know what kind of democracy they want. And you see different variations of it. You know, some of the so-called reformers are secularists. They want the religion out of the running of the state, full stop. They think that the cleric should go back to the mosques and stay there and pray and have nothing to do with government. There's a group of more realistic reformers who are truly Islamic reformers. These are people who were very deeply involved as believing Muslims in the revolution, who say, look, we're an Islamic republic, we should be an Islamic republic, we should have some sort of religious base, but that the rule of the leader, the rule of the velayati faqih, the supreme jurist, as it has evolved, is totalitarian. It is not supposed to be a dictatorship where one man has so much power, and that what has happened is that the position has violated the Constitution. They're arguing that constitutionally he has taken too many powers for himself, or that too many powers have been given to him over the years. So they're saying, let's have a supreme leader who's more of just a spiritual guide for the whole country, but that you have an elected president who has the kind of power that the president in France would have, with an elected parliament, and a much freer judiciary where the courts' trials are open. So this is what is happening politically. Also, the other thing about Iran's political landscape is that there really are no political parties, and there are very few NGOs. It's very difficult to build up a civil society when you don't have institutions, when there's not a mass-based political party or non-governmental organizations where people can come together with a common cause and organize. I mean, this is in part because Iranians tend to be individualists, and I'm sort of using shorthand. It isn't like every single Iranian is an individualist, but historically, Iranians have relied on themselves and their families, but not on institutions, and certainly not institutions of the state. So this is a work in progress.
My voice usually carries quite well without the microphone bell. Set an example. I have two questions for you. The first one is about the difference between European coverage of Iran over the past 2 decades and American coverage. It's really, I mean, we have a very particular political outlook, and that sometimes is reflected very heavily in what is published in the United States. And I was just wondering whether you might comment on just what the difference between what European journalists see in Iran is and American journalists, and then I'll tag on the second one, and if you can hold on to both of them at the same time. You commented on the film that we're going to be showing in a couple of weeks, Two Women, and I was wondering if you would give us an opinion about the film, and I think you said you had interviewed the filmmaker.
Right. Well, European and American journalism are different, whether we're covering Iran or we're covering, Russia or Afghanistan or America. I mean, most dramatically, though, in terms of Iran, was the difference in the way we covered the hostage crisis. We, as Americans, as American journalists, were obsessed with this event. I mean, this is what created Nightline. I mean, most of you were born after Nightline was created, but Ted Koppel did not exist on late-night television before the hostage crisis. I was based in Paris and then in Rome during the hostage crisis, and could only get into Iran episodically because I needed a visa. But what we did is we set up Tehran Central in Paris. We bought a very, very sophisticated shortwave radio to monitor Iranian radio, to monitor the parliamentary debates. We hired full-time a Farsi-speaking Iranian who worked in our bureau, and we kept dialing Iran from morning till night, doing as many telephone interviews as we possibly could. For 444 days, I was also a hostage of the Iran hostage crisis. On a more serious note, European journalists tend to have more leeway in terms of writing opinion pieces. They tend to write more political analyses than Americans. We tend to be more sociological. We tend to write more about women's issues, the issues of youth, economic problems, where, Le Monde, for example, just published a wonderful article a couple of weeks ago about Iran, but it was looking at Iran from the top down. It was looking at the political structure. But both Europeans and American journalists suffer because we have to get visas. We go to Iran with the good graces of the Iranian government. Only Turkish journalists can get in without a visa. Now, there are some resident correspondents in Iran, but as one of them told me when he opened his bureau for his news organization, my main job, my editors told me, was to keep the office open. That contributes, I would say, to a kind of self-censorship, because you have to make sure that you're not going to write anything that's going to close you down. The second question was about the movie Two Women. I think Two Women is one of the best Iranian films I have seen. The reason is that it deals with real-life issues confronting Iranian women today. One of the women is a very modern, forward-looking woman who got a lot of breaks in life, whose husband is a feminist who helps out at home and who's her true partner in life. The other woman is a woman who is the victim of her husband, who basically keeps her as a prisoner in the house, doesn't let her use the phone. And it's the story of her transformation as she is confronted not only with a repressive husband, but with a stalker. It's just a superb film. I saw it for the first time in Iran, and it was so moving for this audience that people were cheering in the middle of the film every time one of the women sort of jumped over a hurdle. So I heartily recommend it.
You mentioned the reconciliation that's developed between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And this would seem to, it's sort of fortune-telling a little bit, or looking into the future, indicate that it may be more difficult for the United States to maintain a dominant control in the Persian Gulf region if that relationship continues to develop. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or when you, with talking with State Department people and things, whether this is something they're really concerned about, where, you know, our involvement in the Gulf will be challenged perhaps more in a unified way by Gulf countries.
That's a very astute observation, and I think one of the reasons that Iran has worked so hard to forge a good relationship with Saudi Arabia is precisely that. Iran wants the United States out of the Persian Gulf. It wants the American military presence out. It's not going to do it militarily. It's going to do it with words. It's going to do it with diplomacy. You know, Iran also still wants to alienate and isolate Iraq. You know, despite the fact that the Iranian foreign minister was just in Baghdad a couple of days ago, and, you know, on the face of it, it looks ominous. The two battle-tested countries in the region are trying to work out their differences at a time when the Palestinians and the Israelis are in the worst situation they've been in 30 years, and where you've had a terrorist act against the United States at the other side of the Persian Gulf. But Iran and Iraq are not ever going to be friends. You know, they've got a lot of outstanding issues to resolve, issues even of prisoners of war, issues of reparation. Iran even has a number of Iraqi warplanes that Iraq foolishly sent to Iran after it invaded Kuwait for safekeeping, and Iran never gave them back. I don't think there is very much strategic thinking about the Persian Gulf in the U.S. government. And I mean, the only institution of government that is seriously looking at where we want to be in the Persian Gulf 10 years from now is the Navy. And you know why? Because they're there every single day. I mean, they have come up with plans for Persian Gulf security that have sat on the shelf of the State Department, because this administration is a crisis-driven administration. You know, I can get Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to call me back if I'm writing a story that is going to appear in my newspaper the next day that she may not like, or I can get Sandy Berger to call me back because they want to preempt me in some way. But, you know, you try to find someone in the administration who's saying, okay, this is where we want to be in one of the most strategic areas of the world long term, and you're not going to find very many people.